The rain came without warning that night. Not the soft kind that taps gently against glass and invites sleep, but the hard, indifferent kind that hammers the city like it has something to prove. On the 70th floor of Grant Tower, where the lights of Manhattan usually blazed like a second sky, only one room remained lit. A single window, pale and cold against the dark, burning like the last ember of something that used to be a fire. Inside, Isabella Grant sat alone on the floor. Not in her chair. Not behind the desk that had been photographed for the covers of 4 business magazines. On the floor, back against the cold glass, knees drawn up, mascara running in thin black rivers down both cheeks. The screen of her laptop cast a blue-white glow across her face, and on that screen, 3 lines refused to disappear no matter how many times she blinked. Net transfer outbound confirmed. Total amount removed. $40 million. Authorization. D. Brooks. Her phone had been ringing since 11 o'clock. She had stopped counting the missed calls somewhere around 30. Journalists. Investors. Board members. The Attorney General's office. People who had stood in this very room and applauded her 2 years ago when Grant Technologies crossed the $1 billion valuation mark. People who had smiled at her across dinner tables and told her she was brilliant, visionary, untouchable. Now their names stacked up on the screen in red notification dots, and every single one of them wanted something from her. An explanation, a resignation, a scapegoat, a body. She pressed her palms flat against the cool marble floor, felt the solidity of it. Tried to remember who she had been 12 hours ago. 12 hours ago, she had been standing at the podium of the Meridian Capital Summit, accepting the Technology Leadership Award for the 3rd consecutive year. The audience had risen to their feet before she even finished speaking. Someone in the front row, a man worth 9 figures, had actually wiped his eye. The headline that ran across the financial wire at 6 that evening read, Isabella Grant Simmons, Legacy as the Queen of Tech. She had read it in the back of her car on the way back to the office. She had not smiled, because she almost never smiled at things like that anymore. But she had felt it, that deep, quiet hum of having built something real. Something that lasted. 12 hours ago, she had believed in the architecture of the life she had constructed, brick by brick, year by year, at the cost of almost everything else. Now, $40 million was gone. And so was Daniel Brooks. And the architecture was rubble. The board meeting had lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes, that was all it took for 8 people who had never once questioned her decisions to arrive at a unanimous verdict. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Gerald Foss, who had known her since she was 26 and fighting for her first round of funding, had looked at her across the conference table with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not concern, pity. Isabella, he had said, quietly and with the careful tone of a man who believes he is being kind, for the good of the shareholders, we need to discuss a transition of leadership. She had not responded. She had simply looked at each of them, one by one, held their gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then walked out of the room without a word. Now she sat on the floor of her office at 2 in the morning, and the rain kept falling, and the city below her glittered like broken glass. The name Daniel Brooks moved through her mind with the slow, sickening weight of something irreversible. 11 years. 11 years of early mornings and 18-hour days and shared takeout containers going cold on conference tables. 11 years of him knowing her passwords and her panic attacks and the particular way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was afraid and wouldn't admit it. 11 years of trusting a person with the whole machinery of your life because you had made the decision early, quietly, without ceremony, that this was the one person in the world who would never use what he knew against you. She had given him everything. Full financial authorization, unrestricted access to every system, every account, every pipeline of data that moved through the company's body like blood. She had done it not out of carelessness but out of something she had not let herself name until tonight: love. Not romantic love, something harder and stranger than that. The love of someone who has survived alone for so long that when they finally decide to trust, they trust without measure. Without reservation. Without exit. Her phone lit up again. The name on the screen read, Marcus Hayes, Board Chair Proxy. She turned it face down on the marble. The screen went dark. The rain filled the silence. She did not hear the door. She became aware of him only when the cleaning cart made a soft sound against the doorframe, the small metallic complaint of wheels on threshold, and she looked up to find a man standing in the entrance to her office. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that does not announce itself, unremarkable at first glance, and then, if you kept looking, quietly arresting. He wore the gray uniform of the building's night maintenance crew, slightly faded at the elbows, his name tag reading Carter, in simple block letters. He carried a mop. He had clearly not expected to find the CEO of a billion-dollar company sitting on the floor in the dark. And for a moment he simply stopped, hand still on the doorframe, absorbing the scene with an expression that was neither shocked nor intrusive, just present, careful in the way of someone who has learned that the first response to someone else's pain should always be stillness. He looked at her. Not at the laptop. Not at the mascara. Not at the phone turned face down on the floor. He looked at her, and he said 3 words. Quietly. Without explanation. Without apology. Trust the truth. Then he backed the cart out of the doorway, turned, and was gone. Isabella Grant sat in the silence those 3 words left behind. Outside, the rain had softened to something almost gentle. She breathed, and for the first time since 11 o'clock, she did not feel entirely alone. She had not always cried on floors. There had been a long time in her life when she had not cried at all, because crying required a certain luxury of privacy that had never been available to her. Isabella Grant was born the youngest of 3 daughters in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gary, Indiana, to a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and a father who had left before Isabella was old enough to form a clear memory of his face. What she remembered instead was the smell of bleach on her mother's hands, the particular creak of the 3rd stair in the dark when her mother came home at midnight, the sound of her older sisters sharing a blanket in the cold because the heat went out every January without fail. She remembered being told, at 6 years old, not to bring friends home from school. She remembered understanding, at 8, exactly why. She did not remember deciding to be different. It was not a decision so much as a slow accretion. The way a river cuts a canyon not through force but through persistence. Through the daily pressure of water against stone. She was 10 when she began dismantling old computers from the junkyard 3 blocks from their apartment and putting them back together. She was 14 when she taught herself to write code. She was 17 when the school counselor told her that girls like her, a phrase she would spend the next 20 years unpacking, did not typically pursue engineering. She applied to 12 universities anyway. She got into 4. She chose the one that offered the most financial aid and the least sympathy. Technology, in those years, was not kind to women. It was particularly unkind to women who had come from nothing, who did not own the right last name, or the right network, or the right particular shade of effortless confidence that came from never having had to fight for a seat at the table. Isabella fought for every seat. She fought in rooms where she was talked over, and in boardrooms where her ideas were credited to the man sitting next to her, and in funding meetings where the investor across the table glanced at his watch twice before she had finished her second sentence. She fought not with bitterness, though she earned bitterness, and no one would have blamed her for carrying it, but with something colder and more precise. She fought with competence so overwhelming that it became its own argument. She did not ask to be seen. She made herself impossible to ignore. Grant Technologies was founded in a sublease office the size of a large closet, with 2 laptops, a folding table, and a corporate credit card with a $2,000 limit. The early years were brutal in the way that all real things are brutal, not glamorous difficulty but grinding. Daily, unsexy difficulty, the kind that does not make for good origin stories because it simply looks like nothing from the outside. She slept on a cot in the back for 14 months. She ate the same 3 meals on rotation. She made 100 calls a day and was told no by 97 of them. She did not take vacations. She did not take weekends. She did not take the kind of long, nourishing pauses in which a person remembers why they wanted anything in the first place. In year 2, when the company was close to its first real collapse, a vendor deal fell through. Payroll was 3 weeks late. 2 of her 5 engineers quit on the same Thursday. a man named Daniel Brooks walked into her office on the recommendation of a mutual contact and offered to work as her interim CFO for 60 days. He was 31, unhurried, with an easy laugh and the kind of organizational mind that could hold 50 numbers in motion simultaneously without losing track of a single one. He restructured her cash flow in 10 days. He renegotiated the vendor contract in 2. By day 30, he had already stopped talking about the end of the 60-day period, and by day 40 she had stopped mentioning it. He simply stayed, and Isabella, who had never in her professional life allowed herself to depend on another person, who had built every system with redundancy because she had learned too early that things and people both eventually fail, made an exception. She told herself it was because he was exceptional at his job, which was true. She did not tell herself the other thing, which was also true, that for the first time since the apartment in Gary with the broken heat and the bleach smell stairs, she had someone who showed up. She built the empire with Daniel beside her. She became the face of it, the one who stood on stages, who gave the interviews, who negotiated with the ferocity and precision that earned her the nickname Iron Lady in the financial press, which she privately found both flattering and reductive. Daniel was the architecture beneath the surface, the scaffolding, the system of systems. She trusted him with everything because he had earned everything, and because trust, for Isabella Grant, was not given in halves. You received all of it, or none, which meant that when he took it, when he reached into the innermost structure of everything she had built and emptied it of $40 million in a single night, he did not merely rob the company. He destroyed the one framework she had ever allowed herself to believe in, the belief that she had, at last, correctly identified a person who would not leave. She had not eaten since morning. The box of takeout on the corner of her desk had been sitting there since 7, untouched, the lid slightly askew. The smell of something that had once been warm now faintly sour in the cold air. She looked at it for a moment and felt nothing. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the city below was silent in the particular way. Cities are silent after rain, cleaner, colder, stripped of the comfortable noise that usually softens their edges. She stood up slowly from the floor, walked to the window, and looked down at 70 floors of nothing between her and the street. She thought about the 3 words. She did not know why she was still thinking about them. They were not unusual words. Any person with a sufficient grasp of English could have assembled them in that order, and yet something in the way he had said them without drama, without explanation, as if he were simply pointing out something she already knew and had temporarily forgotten, had landed in her chest like a key finding a lock. Trust the truth, not trust yourself, not trust the process, not you've got this, or hang in there, or all the other linguistic patches people reach for when they witness someone else's suffering and want to do something but don't know what. The truth, as if the truth were a thing that still existed, somewhere, unchanged and intact, waiting to be found by whoever was willing to look. She opened her laptop again. $40 million. D. Brooks. She stared at it. Then, for the first time since she had received the alert, she did not look at the number. She looked past it. She began to read the transaction metadata. His name was Michael Carter. He was 42 years old. He had worked for the building's contracted maintenance service for 3 years, always on the night shift, 11 to 7, 5 days a week. He drove a 6-year-old sedan with a cracked rear bumper and a child's drawing of a sun taped to the dashboard on the passenger side. His daughter's name was Lily. She was 8. She had her father's eyes calm, dark, observant, and her late mother's laugh, which came suddenly and without apology, and filled whatever room it entered. Michael Carter had been a different person once. Not different in character. Those who had known him in both lives would say, if pressed, that the essential thing about him had remained constant. That quiet precision, that habit of looking directly at problems without flinching but different in circumstance, in context, in the particular ecosystem in which his abilities had been deployed. For 11 years, he had worked as a senior cybersecurity architect for a federal intelligence contractor, the kind of work that does not appear on LinkedIn and is described on official documents with language deliberately designed to be uninformative. He had built systems meant to resist the most sophisticated intrusion attempts in the world. He had identified vulnerabilities in infrastructure that governments did not know were vulnerable. He had testified, under a pseudonym, before a closed congressional subcommittee at the age of 34. He was, by every metric available to the people who measured such things, exceptional. He left the day after his wife's funeral. Her name had been Claire. She had been a nurse, which he had always found quietly funny. Two people whose entire professional lives were spent fortifying against the things that could go wrong. And neither of them had seen the aneurysm coming. She was there in the morning, laughing at something Lily had said at the breakfast table, and she was gone by 2 in the afternoon, and the world did not slow down or rearrange itself in acknowledgement of what had been lost. The apartment was the same. The furniture was the same. Lily was 4 years old and did not fully understand, and the not fully understanding was somehow worse than understanding would have been, because Michael could not grieve openly without frightening her, and so he grieved in layers in the car, in the shower, in the 3 minutes between when Lily fell asleep and when he allowed himself to stop performing steadiness. He resigned from the contractor. He turned down 3 subsequent offers, each more generous than the last, each arriving with the assumption that money was the primary object and that enough of it would restore whatever had been disrupted. He took the maintenance job because it was nights, which meant his days were free. Free to walk Lily to school. Free to be there when she came home. Free to sit on the floor of their apartment, with building blocks and make cities out of cardboard boxes, and read the same picture book 11 times in a row because she loved it, truly loved it, and that love was the most real thing remaining in his life, and he was not going to be elsewhere while it happened. The people at the building knew him as Carter. They did not ask questions. He did not offer answers. He emptied the trash cans on floors 40 through 70, and mopped the hallways and replaced burned-out bulbs, and was polite to the security guards and invisible to almost everyone else. Almost. It was the data that had caught his attention first. Not intentionally, he was not looking for it. Was not in the habit of looking for anything beyond the immediate requirements of his shift. But 3 weeks before the night, he found Isabella Grant crying on her office floor. He had been replacing the lighting fixture in the server corridor on the 52nd floor when he noticed, through the partially open door of a secondary data closet, a terminal that had been left logged in and running a transfer protocol that struck him, immediately, and without calculation, as wrong. Not wrong in a way he could have articulated to a layperson, wrong in the way a musician hears a single false note in a chord and knows it without needing to think about why. He had looked at it for precisely 7 seconds, memorized the visible parameters, and then continued replacing the light fixture. He had said nothing. He thought about it for 3 weeks. He ran the numbers in his head, the way he used to run intrusion scenarios in the contractor's basement offices, quietly, methodically, without ego, assembling the pieces in the order that logic required, rather than the order that confirmed any particular conclusion. By the end of the 3rd week, he had arrived at a picture that disturbed him. Not because of the scale of it, he had seen larger compromises in his other life, but because of the architecture. It was elegant. It was patient. It had been constructed over a long period of time by someone with genuine sophistication and genuine access. And whoever had built it had been careful to ensure that when it triggered, every surface indicator would point toward one person. The woman on the 70th floor. He had been debating with himself for 3 days about whether to say anything. And then he had walked into her office and found her sitting on the floor, and the debate had resolved itself. He told her on the 2nd night. He came back at midnight with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine on the 44th floor. Bad coffee, thin and slightly burned, in styrofoam cups with lids that never quite seated properly, and he set one beside her on the desk without ceremony, sat down in the chair across from her, and told her what he had seen, and what he had concluded, and what he believed could be proven. Isabella listened without interrupting. This was unusual for her. She was a person who listened fast, who processed in parallel, who generally began forming her response before the other person had finished forming their thought. But she listened to Michael Carter in a different way. The way you listen when you are not sure what you are hearing, but you recognize, on some level below rational assessment, that it matters. When he finished, she sat for a moment in silence. "How do you know all of this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I used to do something else," he said. "Before." "What?" He looked at his coffee cup. "I protected systems from exactly this kind of attack." He paused. "I was good at it." "Why are you mopping floors?" He looked up at her then, and his expression was not defensive, not embarrassed, not the expression of a man who has been found out in something shameful. It was simply honest. "My daughter needed a father who was present," he said. "The other job didn't allow for that." A beat. "She's 8. You only get so many years when they still want you around." Isabella said nothing. She was not entirely sure what she felt. Something in the chest that she did not have a ready category for. She looked at her reflection in the dark window across the room and thought, for a moment, that she barely recognized the woman looking back. "What do you need?" she asked. "To prove it, access to the primary backup server on floor 52, he said. "The one that's been offline since the maintenance cycle 6 weeks ago. It won't have the edited files. It'll have what was actually there. And if we find what you think we'll find, then you'll have everything you need," he said. "Every transaction, every authorization, every message." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "The person who built this was skilled," he said. "But they made one mistake." "What was that?" "They assumed you wouldn't look back far enough," he said. "They built the lie on top of the truth, thinking the truth was buried too deep to find." He paused. "It isn't. They went at 1 in the morning, when the building was as close to empty as it ever got. The hallways on the lower floors were lit with the flat, purposeless brightness of security, lighting the kind that exists not to illuminate but to witness, to record the passage of things through space in case a record is ever needed." The elevator descended in silence. Isabella had changed out of her heels into the spare running shoes she kept in her office closet, and the sound of her footsteps in the corridor was softer than she expected, almost tentative, as if the floor itself were uncertain. Michael led the way with the quiet directness of someone who had done this, not this exactly, but the essential shape of this, the movement through dark corridors toward something concealed many times before. The server room was cold, not cool cold, the aggressive, deliberate cold of a space maintained at precise temperature for the benefit of machines rather than people. The blue indicator lights of the server stacks lined the walls in rows, blinking in slow, indifferent rhythms. The backup server Michael had identified was in the far corner, sealed behind a secondary access panel that required a maintenance override code. He entered the code from memory. He had memorized every access code in the building in his first month, not for any specific purpose but because it was a habit he could not unlearn, the automatic cataloging of systems and their vulnerabilities that had been his professional reflex for a decade. The terminal came alive. Isabella stood behind him and watched the data materialize on the screen, and felt something shift in her understanding of the last several months. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden flash of clarity, but a slow and devastating clarification, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, detail by detail, until the image is undeniable. The numbers were there. The original numbers, unaltered, time-stamped with the precision of a system that did not know it was supposed to be a witness. And alongside them, in a separate directory that should not have existed, a chain of communications that had been routed through an external server, and then scrubbed from every accessible archive. Every accessible archive except this one, which had gone offline before the scrubbing began. The communications were between Daniel Brooks and a man named Victor Hale. Victor Hale was a member of the board of directors. He had been on the board for 4 years. He had a pleasant manner, a reputation for fiscal conservatism, and a quiet, long-standing investment relationship with a private equity firm that had, in the past 18 months, been assembling a significant position in Grant Technologies through a series of shell companies that were, on their surface, entirely unrelated to one another. The plan, as Isabella read it in the cold blue light of the server room, was neither complicated nor original, which was perhaps the most insulting thing about it. Daniel had been approached 2 years ago. He had been offered a figure she would not think about directly for several weeks afterward. He had been asked to do 3 things. Transfer the money, making it look like misappropriation by the CEO, plant false financial records that suggested a pattern of reckless decision-making traceable to Isabella, and then disappear, leaving her to face the consequences of both. With Isabella gone resigned, under pressure, or removed by the board, the equity firm would make their move. Victor Hale would oversee the acquisition. The company would be absorbed, restructured, renamed. Grant Technologies would cease to exist as an independent entity, and the woman who had built it from a closet-sized sublease would be remembered, if at all, as the cautionary tale of someone who flew too high. Daniel had accepted. He had done everything he was asked to do, and then he had run. Isabella stood very still in the server room for a long moment. The lights blinked. The cold pressed in. Michael said nothing. He understood, instinctively, that this was a moment that required no commentary. She breathed out slowly. "I need everything," she said. "All of it. Formatted so that anyone in a room can understand it in 30 seconds. I can have it ready by 6, he said. The shareholder meeting is at 9. Then I'll have it ready by 6, he said again, without inflection. She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question. Not the way people consider questions when they are trying to decide what answer is safe, but genuinely. As if the question deserved the actual work of being thought about. "Because it's the right thing," he said finally, "and because you haven't done anything wrong." He paused. "And because Lily asks me every night what I did at work. And I want to be able to give her an honest answer." The morning arrived gray and cold, the sky still carrying the residue of the previous night's rain. The shareholder meeting was held in the main conference hall on the 42nd floor, a room designed for exactly this kind of occasion, with the particular aesthetic of institutional seriousness, dark wood paneling, long tables arranged in a shallow U-shape, chairs upholstered in charcoal fabric that managed to be simultaneously expensive and uncomfortable. The press section along the back wall was full. Isabella counted at least 20 journalists, along with the crews from 3 financial news networks, whose cameras had been positioned, she noted, at angles optimized for capturing the moment of her departure. She arrived alone. She had been advised, by 3 separate attorneys in the last 4 hours, not to come at all to let the legal process work, to stay away from the room, to avoid the optics of a public confrontation she was likely to lose. She had listened to all 3 of them carefully, and then done what she always did with advice that asked her to retreat from something important. She had thanked them politely and ignored them completely. The room went quiet when she entered. Not the polite quiet of a meeting, coming to order, the particular quiet of a room that has been expecting something and is now watching to see whether it materializes. She walked to the seat at the head of the table that she had occupied for 9 years and sat down. Gerald Foss, across the room, looked at her with the same expression of careful pity he had worn the night before. Victor Hale, 3 seats to Gerald's left, looked at her with nothing at all on his face, a blankness so complete and so well maintained that it was itself a kind of admission. Gerald called the meeting to order. He spoke for several minutes in the measured cadence of someone who has practiced the exact degree of regret in their voice enough to register, not enough to be challenged. He outlined the situation. He presented the preliminary financial forensics, which had been assembled in haste and which told the story that had been designed for them to tell. He proposed, with the full support of the board, a motion requiring the immediate resignation of the current CEO pending a comprehensive internal and external investigation. The motion was seconded before Gerald had fully finished the sentence. The room turned toward Isabella. She stood up. The cameras found her. She looked at the room, at the board members and the investors and the journalists and the screens running the live market feeds that showed Grant Technologies stock at its lowest point in 4 years, and she did not speak immediately. She let the silence sit. She had learned, a long time ago, that silence before speaking is not weakness. It is the establishment of terms. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'd like to present some additional financial documentation that wasn't available for this morning's preliminary report." Gerald frowned. Victor Hale's expression did not change. "That's irregular," Gerald said. The agenda was set based on incomplete information," Isabella said. Her voice was level. She nodded once toward the back of the room. In the back of the room, near the door, standing in his maintenance uniform because there had not been time to change, Michael Carter connected a drive to the room's presentation system. On every screen in the room, the main display, the secondary monitors, the live feed going out to the broadcast networks, a new set of documents appeared. Transaction records, communication logs, transfer authorizations, shell company registration documents tracing back through 7 layers of corporate structure to a single private equity account. An account associated with a board member sitting in this room. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. That silence had been anticipatory. This one was the silence of a room in which everyone is processing the same new information simultaneously and arriving, at different speeds, at the same conclusion. Victor Hale stood up. He said nothing. He walked to the door. The two security officers who had been stationed there since 6 that morning at Michael's quiet suggestion, communicated to Isabella in a text at 5:45, moved to intercept him. He stopped. He looked back at the room with an expression that Isabella would remember for a long time. Not defiance, not panic, but a kind of flat, cold resignation, the look of a man who had always known that this particular architecture had a flaw and had been waiting, in some compartment of himself, to discover which moment the flaw would become visible. At the same hour, at the International Departures Terminal of JFK, a man matching the description of Daniel Brooks was detained by 2 federal agents who had been issued a warrant at 6:47 that morning. He had been in the departures queue for a flight to Sao Paulo. He had a bag. He had a new identity, not a very good one, as it turned out, because the person who had provided it had been identified as a known associate of a network that Michael Carter had once spent 11 months mapping at the request of a federal agency, and Michael had included that information as a footnote in the documentation he prepared during the night. The meeting continued for another hour and 20 minutes. By the end of it, Gerald Foss had moved a second motion unanimously seconded, reinstating Isabella Grant, with full authority pending a now inverted investigation into the conduct of 2 board members and the activities of a private equity firm whose lawyers were, at that moment, making frantic and largely unsuccessful phone calls to one another in offices across 3 time zones. The market reacted at opening with the kind of volatility that financial analysts would spend the next week trying to characterize in ways that made it sound comprehensible, which it was not, because markets are not comprehensible, they are emotional, and what happened in that room had been emotional. And the world had watched it happen in real time. Isabella held her own press briefing at noon, in the smaller conference room on the 38th floor, without notes. She spoke for 7 minutes and took 4 questions. When the 4th journalist asked her, with the particular edge of someone who has already written the story in their head and is looking for a quote to fit it, whether she thought the experience had changed her view of people she trusted, she paused for a moment. "It changed my view of where truth lives," she said. "I used to think it lived in the numbers, in the systems, in the data. I was wrong." She paused again. "It lives in the people who refuse to look away from it." She did not name Michael Carter. He had asked her not to, very quietly, at 5 in the morning when they had finished assembling the documents and were sitting in the server room with the last of the bad coffee going cold in their styrofoam cups. Lily would have to change schools, he had said, and she had understood immediately what he meant, not that he feared attention, but that the life he had built around his daughter's stability was precise and deliberate, and did not have room in it for the kind of disruption that fame, even temporary and second-hand fame, could generate. She had nodded. She had kept her word. The weeks that followed were strange and full and very unlike anything Isabella had previously associated with the experience of winning. She had won before. She had closed rounds of funding and beaten out competitors for contracts, and stood on stages, and received standing ovations. She knew what winning felt like. It felt like forward momentum. It felt like the particular satisfaction of a machine running correctly, of systems operating according to design, of goals achieved in the brief, already receding moment of recognition before the next goal appeared on the horizon. It felt like being in motion. This felt different. Quieter. More like the morning after a storm, when the air is different, cleaner, and somehow more itself, and you can see further than you could before, not because the distance has changed, but because what was obscuring it has been removed. She sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the meeting, and looked at the city and thought about the conversation she had not been able to stop thinking about, not the one in the server room, not the one in the boardroom, but the short one in the corridor outside the building's ground floor exit. At 6:15 in the morning, in the cold pre-dawn gray, when Michael had been about to walk to his car, and she had stopped him. "Can I ask you something?" she had said. "Sure. Do you miss it?" The other work. He had considered this with the same unhurried honesty he brought to every question. "Parts of it," he said. "The puzzle of it. The precision." He looked at the car, the cracked rear bumper, the sun drawing on the dashboard. "But Lily asked me last week if we could go camping this summer. Just us. Sleep in a tent and look at stars." He paused. "I can do that now. I couldn't before." He looked at her. Some things are worth more than the job. She thought about that conversation at odd moments in the following weeks. She thought about it when she was in back-to-back meetings that ran from 7 in the morning to 9 at night, and she looked up from her laptop at 10 and realized she had not eaten since morning again. She thought about it when she walked past the row of framed magazine covers in the corridor outside the boardroom, the Iron Lady, the Queen of Tech, the billion-dollar CEO, and felt, for the first time, not pride, but a kind of gentle unease, the way you feel when you look at a photograph of yourself from long ago and recognize the face but not quite the person. She thought about it when her assistant, a bright 24-year-old named Sophie, who worked brutal hours without complaint because she had absorbed the unspoken culture of the place, stopped her in the hallway one morning to give her a message, and Isabella noticed, for the first time, that Sophie looked tired in a way that was not the ordinary tiredness of a long week. It was the deeper kind. The kind that accumulates. "When did you last take a full day off?" Isabella asked her. Sophie blinked. "I'm sorry? A day? Off? Not checking your phone? Not responding to anything? A day?" Sophie thought about it. "March," she said, with the particular tone of someone who is not entirely sure that's the right answer. Isabella nodded. She said nothing more about it that morning, but she went back to her office and opened a new document and began writing something she had never written before. A company policy on rest. The restructuring of Grant Technologies began, officially, in the second month after the crisis. The legal process proceeded. Daniel Brooks had accepted a plea arrangement that required, among other things, full cooperation with the investigation into Victor Hale and the equity firm, which had taken on a dimension larger than initially apparent, and which would eventually implicate 2 additional board members and a financial advisor Isabella had worked with for 6 years. She did not feel betrayal at this news, exactly. She felt a kind of tired clarity. She had built something that people with less scruple had wanted badly enough to destroy. And the wanting had been, at its root, a form of recognition. She tried to hold that thought loosely, without comfort, because comfort from it felt too easy. But alongside the legal proceedings, alongside the structural rebuilding of financial oversight systems and board governance and the careful, deliberate reconstruction of the company's executive team, this time with people she chose for character first and competence second, because she had learned, at great cost, what it looked like when you inverted that priority, she began doing things she had not done before. She met with employees, not in town halls or structured Q&A formats or leadership cascades, but actually met with them, sat in the break room on the 14th floor with a cup of coffee, and let whoever was there talk to her. She learned the names of people who had worked in her company for years and whom she had never once addressed directly. She learned that the woman who ran the data quality team had been raising twins alone since her husband left. She learned that the man who managed the overnight IT desk had been supporting his mother through chemotherapy for 11 months and had not told anyone because he was afraid it would affect his performance reviews. She learned that the company she had built, the one she had given everything to, was populated by people who were doing things she had never made room to see. She established, in the 4th month, the Foundations Fund, a company initiative designed to provide financial and structural support for single parents within the organization, a program she announced at the all-hands meeting without a great deal of ceremony, without a prepared speech, in the flat and direct language of someone who has arrived at a decision through living rather than deliberation. The response was not the polite, professional applause of the town halls she remembered. People cried. People she had never seen express anything other than the particular armor of corporate composure cried, quietly, at their desks, in the manner of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have just been given, unexpectedly, permission to set it down. She did not stop working hard. She did not transform into a different person, did not undergo the kind of tidy, compressed conversion that stories sometimes assign to people who have survived difficult things. She was still Isabella Grant, still precise, still demanding, still capable of the controlled ferocity that had always been her particular signature. But she moved through the work differently, less like someone proving something, more like someone building something. The distinction was hard to explain and immediately recognizable to anyone who encountered her after the change. She saw Michael and Lily on a Sunday afternoon in October, 6 months after the night in the server room. She had not planned to. She was walking through the park near the office, something she had recently committed to doing at least twice a week, because she had realized that she had lived in this city for 15 years and could count the times she had simply walked in it on one hand, and she saw them on a bench near the fountain. Lily was eating a red popsicle with the full, unhurried commitment of someone who has nowhere else to be. Michael was reading something on a battered paperback, and he had the particular quality of stillness that Isabella had come to associate with him. Not the stillness of someone forcing themselves to be still, but the natural stillness of someone who has made peace with the present moment and is simply in it. Lily saw her first. She looked up from the popsicle with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pre-filter her responses based on social hierarchy, and said, "Are you the lady from Dad's work?" Isabella smiled. She was not sure, in the moment, how many months it had been since she had smiled in a way that started from the inside rather than the surface. It had been a while. "I am," she said. Lily considered this. "Dad says you're really smart," she said. A pause. "He says, you just forgot something important for a while." Michael looked up from his book. He met Isabella's eyes with an expression that was equal parts amusement and apology. She shook her head slightly. No apology needed. She sat down on the bench. Lily offered her the popsicle, which she accepted, taking a small bite because it seemed rude not to, and which turned out to be grape-flavored and aggressively cold and genuinely pleasant. The three of them sat for a while in the thin October sun, and Lily talked about a project she was doing at school about birds. She had become interested in migration patterns, the way birds navigate by stars and magnetic fields, and the memory of routes they have never personally traveled, but somehow carry in them. And Isabella listened, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the fountain, and the city moved around them in the easy, indifferent way that cities move when they are simply being lived in. Later, walking home, Isabella thought about what Lily had said. "He says, you just forgot something important." She turned the sentence over. She thought about the apartment in Gary, and the building block cities, and the 12 applications and the 100 calls a day, and the cot in the back of the first office, and the year she had worked 80 hours a week for so long that the weeks stopped having individual character and became a single continuous texture of effort. She thought about all of it without judgment, without the retroactive shame that sometimes attaches itself to the recognition of what has been lost. She had not been wrong to build what she built. The building had been real. The cost had been real too. Both things could be true. 6 months after the worst night of her life, Grant Technologies reported its strongest quarterly performance in company history. The number appeared in the financial press alongside analysis and commentary that attributed it to various strategic factors: restructured governance, renewed investor confidence, and leadership continuity in the face of adversity, all of which were true, and none of which quite captured what Isabella understood to be the actual source. The actual source was harder to quantify. It had something to do with people who felt seen, who worked differently when the person at the top of the structure was present in a way that was not purely transactional. It had something to do with the particular energy that moves through an organization when the people inside it believe that they matter to the person they work for. It was not a management philosophy. It was something older and simpler. It was the recognition that companies are made of people. And people are capable of extraordinary things when they are treated as though their full lives, not just the productive hours of their full lives, but the whole complicated human weight of them, are real and worth accounting for. A journalist from a major financial publication, writing a long profile of Isabella for their end-of-year issue, asked her a question near the end of their interview that had clearly been crafted with care. "You've been called Iron Lady, the Queen of Tech, a force of nature," the journalist said. "What do you want to be called now?" Isabella thought about it. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary afternoon way. "Honest," she said. The journalist wrote that down. Then she looked up. Is there anything you'd want to say to the people who believed in you during the crisis? The ones who stayed? Isabella was quiet for a moment. She thought about Michael Carter and a cup of bad coffee at 1 in the morning, and 3 words that had arrived without explanation and cost nothing to say and changed everything. She thought about Lily and the popsicle and the birds that navigate by stars and the memory of routes they have never personally traveled but somehow carry in them. She thought about the truth, how it had not moved, had not changed, had not adapted itself to the convenience of people who wanted it buried. It had simply waited. In a backup server on the 52nd floor, in the cold and dark, patient and complete. I'd say that what saves you is rarely what you think it will be, she said. And the person who saves you is almost never who you'd expect. She looked at the recorder on the table. The most powerful thing I encountered during the worst period of my professional life was not a strategy or a legal argument or a media campaign. It was someone who looked at me when I had nothing left and told me to trust the truth. A pause. 3 words. From a man the whole world would have looked past without seeing. She was quiet for a moment. I think about that a lot. The profile ran on a Tuesday in December. By Thursday, it had been referenced in several other publications, in the particular way that a story gets retold, when it contains something that people recognize as more true than the usual kind of true, more useful, somehow, or more necessary. The title Grant's office chose for the response they did not write was the sentence that appeared in the article's final paragraph, extracted and circulated by readers who had not been asked to circulate anything, but had done so anyway. Because it said what they needed something to say. Sometimes the person who saves you is not the most powerful person in the room. Sometimes they're the one everyone else looked past. On an ordinary afternoon in the same December, in a school auditorium in the East Village, a man named Michael Carter sat in a folding chair in the 2nd row and watched his daughter perform in her school's winter concert. She played the recorder badly, with tremendous commitment, her tongue pressed to the tip of it in concentration, and her eyes fixed on the music stand with a focus that was unmistakably his. The auditorium was warm and slightly overcrowded, and smelled of coats and popcorn, and the particular warmth of a room full of families who have come to watch children do something. In the row behind him, a woman in a gray coat sat down a few minutes after the concert started. Quietly, without drawing attention. She did not say anything. She watched. At the end, when the children took their bow and the audience broke into applause that was entirely disproportionate to the quality of the performance and entirely appropriate to everything else about it, the woman in the gray coat clapped with the rest of them. When the lights came up, Lily found her father in the crowd and ran to him, still holding the recorder, and he picked her up the way you pick up a child when they are at the outer edge of the age, when picking them up is still possible carefully, with an awareness that this, too, is temporary, and she buried her face in his shoulder, and he held on. From somewhere behind him, quietly, a voice said, "She's wonderful." He looked back. Isabella Grant stood 2 rows away, holding her coat over one arm. And she was smiling with her whole face, not the surface smile he had seen in photographs, the one that was a professional instrument, but the other kind, the kind that means something has been given back. "She is," he said. Lily lifted her head and looked at the woman in the gray coat. "Did you like the concert?" she asked. "Very much," Isabella said. Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "I made 2 mistakes," she said. "But Dad says, mistakes are just information." Isabella looked at Michael. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then back at her, and something moved between them that did not require language, the particular understanding of 2 people who have been through a true thing together and have arrived, on the other side of it, slightly more themselves than they were before. "Your dad is right," Isabella said. She looked at Lily. "Mistakes are just information. The question is what you do with it." Lily nodded, satisfied. She looked at her recorder. Then she looked back up. "Are you coming for hot chocolate?" she asked. "Dad said we could go after." Isabella paused. She had a dinner. She had 3 messages. She had not returned. She had the perpetual accumulating weight of the thing she had built and the responsibility that came with it, the thing that did not stop when the workday stopped, that had not stopped, in 20 years, for anything except the worst night of her life. "Yes," she said. I'd like that very much. They walked out of the school together into the December night. And the city was cold and full of light. And the stars were not visible through the amber sky, but somewhere above all of it, passing over in the dark, birds were navigating by routes they had never personally traveled, but somehow carried in them. Following truths older than any individual decision, older than betrayal, older than the particular human capacity for both damage and repair. Following something that did not change regardless of what was done to obscure it, something that simply waited, in the cold and dark, to be found by whoever was willing to keep looking. Trust the truth. 3 words, no explanation, no ceremony. Sometimes that is all it takes.